Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for Being Libertarian LLC, which includes BeingLibertarian.com, Think-Liberty.com, RationalStandard.com, and of course, Champion Books, which does have its inaugural book out, Igniting Liberty, Voices for Freedom Around the World. If you haven't gotten a copy, do make sure that you do. It's great content in there. As always, you can follow us on all forms of social media. You can listen to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow myself directly on Facebook by following Killian Hobbs, author. And with all that said and done, we're going to roll right into the episode. Now, last week I had made mention that I was going to start having a series of guests on to go through specific philosophers. Now, since this is going to be the first episode in this series, I do want to clarify that I'm not going to be going into any particular order, I should say. So it's not going to be this person followed by this person followed by this person. I'm not going to do it that way, but rather I wanted to go through it based on some people that I find interesting or people that their ideas, I think, can really benefit the kind of conversations that I've been having throughout a lot of the previous episodes of the series, if you've been following me since episode 1. So for today's episode, I actually am joined by a guest, Michael. Go ahead and say hello to everybody here.
How's it going, guys?
I'm glad to have you on. Michael here, he's one of the people behind Sarcasm Liberty. If you haven't followed that page, you definitely should. Some of the funniest shit I've come across in a long time is on that page for sure. You host a podcast over there as well, do you not?
Yes, we do have a podcast on YouTube. We call it a live stream, though. It's not technically a podcast, but I guess has the same format.
Sorry. I don't follow a lot of the YouTube stuff. I'm sorry about that. I really should tune into the stuff that you do over there, though.
Actually, we don't really advertise YouTube that well. Actually, we should start advertising a little bit better. So,
yeah, you can also see Michael if you ever go into what's the group you live stream debate people in? Atheism versus Theism.
Yeah, well, actually, we made a public one just for video debates. That way, you could share them to different pages and whatever, so you don't have to be inside a particular page to view them. So I made one called The Stage, and we also have one called The Thunderdome, and they both kind of operate on the same idea of just getting people to get live debates going on, contrasting ideas, discussions out in the open.
And if it's one thing that I'm all about, it's definitely argumentation.
Of course.
So for today's episode, what we're going to go into is we're going to be covering Spinoza. Now, those of you who are unaware, Spinoza is a Dutch philosopher. It's actually relatively, how do you say, he's a kind of multinational, I guess you could say, because he's a Jewish Dutch philosopher that was born or lived through in the Netherlands, primarily.
Actually, he was a Portuguese Jew. And
Portuguese, yes.
Yeah, they moved to the Netherlands, because they had a safe haven there at the time. So he grew up in a very traditional Jewish family, traditional Jewish education, and he basically grew up to despise that education.
Yeah. So to go through a couple of things that he's most known for, he's definitely known for his work with rationalism, conceptualism. He's had quite a few different theories as far as the Abrahamic faiths are concerned, ethics are concerned, determinism, psychophysical concepts, and his own school of thought, which is referred to as Spinozism, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I might not be.
Yeah.
So for the episode here, we're just going to kind of go through what he stood for, some of his ideas, kind of where I guess you could say his strengths were argumentatively, where some of the weaknesses might lie, or where some of his some critiques might hold weight against him, and just really go into what his works were about. Now, normally these are only about 30-minute episodes, so I don't know exactly how much we'll be able to cover the massive depth of his work in this time period, but that's the reason why I've got Michael on here to help me out with this.
Oh, it would take a lifetime, my friend. Yeah. I'm still going through it. So
yeah, there's a lot of depth to his work, and I mean, there's only so many books that he wrote, of course, but he drew on so many different influences and ended up influencing so many different people. I mean, Hegel, Rousseau, Leibniz, Goethe. so many of it helped Strauss. So many of them drew on the kind of work that Spinoza laid out that, I mean, it would be hard to say that you could even have Enlightenment philosophy without some of the things that he brought into the fold as far as his philosophy was concerned.
Yeah.
One that I'm particularly interested in that I think we'll probably start off with here, one of his key concepts was that of substance, attributes, and modes. Would you like to expand on that a little bit and try to explain what that was about?
Yeah, well, the concept starts at Aristotle, goes into Descartes, and he really took the Descartes model of substance and kind of pushed it to the absolute extreme. And he kind of explains that substance as the origin or God of everything that's existent. And the modes are different modifications of that God or of that substance that make up the different kinds of existence.
Mm-hmm. So could you give me an example of this? Like, I remember he gives some example of things like blame and praise and certain ideas like that. So let's try to put this into a context.
Yeah, well, there's two realms of it. There's the matter end, and then there's the ideas end, because there's things like ideas that can't really be touched, and obviously those things are real, even though we can't touch them, observe them, and so on and so forth.
Okay. So from going a little, I guess, sidebarish, if you will, does that relate at all to the mind-body problem that's plagued the rationalist empiricist divide?
A little bit. He attacks it in a very different way than probably anyone else. I'm not sure if there's anyone that really approaches it very similar. He basically he takes it all from coming from the one source of God, and coming into each individual's mind, and whether that idea is clear or not depends on the person and their ability to reason.
Okay, yeah, that's if I recall correctly, he called that neutral monism, I believe was the phrase that he used for it. I'm a little rusty on my Spinoza, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, I mean, his terms, like, he has his own dictionary in there, so it's hard to get into the terms, because what he means by things means like completely other things. So it ends up being a losing battle when you go into terms with him, because it's not going to mean anything compared to what we know.
Yeah, that's one of the things that for anyone that decides to go out and read his works, that you have to keep an idea of the language of the time, because a lot of the concepts that were being discussed, the way that we interpret them now is heavily based on the type of conversations that were taking place when these original works were written. So the ideas of what a self was, these were what today we might consider a little more of a basic concept, or at least there's more defined terminology that we can use when we're discussing it. These were very loose ideas which needed to be pinned down for there to be a philosophy around them. And I think that as much as there are those, I guess you could say, language issues with some of Spinoza's work, is that by actually pinning down definitions and explaining what he means by them and then using them to argue, he actually makes a very clear case for what he's trying to present, rather than just making the case and then, as I mentioned in the last episode, having a lot of it fall through in the game of semantics. Yeah, there's a lot of philosophers I find that really, they lose ground in the semantics game because they ignore it. And unfortunately, a large portion of philosophy has become about those semantics, about, I guess you could say, the epistemology behind the terms that we're using to describe how certain things might function, and trying to find language pitfalls rather than actual ideological pitfalls. But I really like the way that Spinoza dodged that. He was very clear in the way that he described how he was using words. I mean, to put it into ways a little bit more similar to how to things the audience might be more familiar with. Assumedly, the people that are listening to a libertarian podcast are at least somewhat familiar with the works of Rothbard. Rothbard was very clear in how he defined property and how he defined ownership and how he used those terms based on the way he defined it. Spinoza, I found, was very similar in this regard. He was very clear in how he was using the terms that he was using, even though the way that it spiraled out into all of these different ideas that he had, which were completely out of left field for his time, they made perfect sense because he laid that foundation. It's one of the reasons why I think he still treated as foundational of a philosopher as he is.
Oh, absolutely. And, you're talking about...
One thing, though, that I guess you could say is a little more applicative is probably his magnum opus, which would have been Ethics. Now,
yeah.
How would you describe the ethics of Spinoza?
All right, so like you were saying about the definitions, he lays his definitions, his axioms out right in the front, and sets himself up to make sense with all of his arguments. Spinoza argued for a very different kind of God than you would see in the Christian religion, the Jewish religion. He didn't necessarily talk of a God of non-interference, but there was no heaven, there was no salvation. It was just more of a causal effect of things, which is, why a lot of atheists actually take a shine to him, because he kind of seems like a materialist off the get-go, even though he's really not when it comes down to it.
Mm-hmm. He was also a known pantheist, was he not?
I wouldn't necessarily say pantheist. There's actually a lot of argument on this topic. Most people think he's a pantheist. When I first read him, I thought he was a pantheist. So I think it's very easy to get that misconception. But there is this separation of infinite and finite that, makes it a little bit separate from pantheism. I like to call it panentheism, even though I know that's not even a correct word, because you're trying to ascribe labels to probably the most unique philosopher and thinker mankind's ever known.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of one of his more influential, like his levels of influence, I should say, there's quite a few different philosophers that his works had influenced. Oddly enough, there seemed to have been like a really weird collection that I'm going to say, because I know that I'm speaking me and English every single time I have one of these podcasts. I swear to God, me and English are not friends. But what I was going to say is, throughout the 19th, 20th centuries, Karl Marx liked some of Spinoza's work because his account of the universe viewed it very materialistically. Quite notably, John Locke was influenced by some of his concept of democratic government, religious tolerance. Even Nietzsche actually found his works to be at least somewhat positive, if nothing else, influential, even though he never particularly liked him or any other philosopher for that matter. Nietzsche just really didn't like people to begin with, especially Germans for whatever reason, despite the things he ended up inspiring. But that'll probably be a different episode.
And actually, speaking of which, quite a few Nazis actually took to Spinoza's liking, but they hated him because he was an ethnic Jew. So it's kind of funny how just this wide range of people, like you just mentioned Karl Marx and John Locke in the same sentence. Most people are probably scratching their heads on that one. And I think that kind of speaks to how unique he is, where it's like people can kind of get different ideas from his philosophy and kind of spring different things from it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's one of the things I say would set him down as a foundational philosopher, because it's sort of like with Hume and the idea of Hume's guillotine, or even Christopher Hitchens with the Hitchens razor, or different philosophical tools that you come across. There's ideas that get laid down that are so foundational or so core into the point of an entire realm of philosophy that you have to call it almost radical. And I find the way that he took the concept of God and took the concept of ethics, the universe, the way we interpret it, the way we interact with it, and he found a way to simplify it down, even though his works are not simple. I'm not going to say that, but He found a way
Definitely
to
not.
simplify it to such a point that any of the ideas that he was bringing out of it became almost inarguable.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that his works can't be challenged. Obviously, we can still challenge the concept of whether there's, atheism versus theism of any kind, whether it's more conceptual in his sense or the more traditional Abrahamic faiths or what have you.
Yeah.
And also the same thing with his ethics, because his ethics are based very much on his view of the world, which, well, there's a reason why there was or still is a rationalist versus imperialist debate.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think it's all really conceptual when you really think about it. I mean, the Bible has the claims of, the divine messages, and that's only as good as you believe it. So I think that was a central point in Spinoza's philosophy, where it's like, we have ideas. The central point of his philosophy is really his philosophy of ideas and where they come from and how they come from God. And the argument he really set out was that ideas exist. Our ideas seemingly come from ourselves, but obviously, if they came from ourselves in an individual form, then things would just be a mess, and we wouldn't have any kind of certainty of any kind of logic at all or reason at all. So he kind of put down that proposition that it had to come from some ultimate force, that being God, substance, whatever you want to, call it in his philosophy.
Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at that kind of origin point, I guess you could say, we could use that as a starting point. You could see kind of how these almost theological, like I would say that it's more general metaphysics than just pure theology. At least my interpretation of it would be, because yes, he does lay down the concept of a God, or a concept of forms in the universe that we need to work off of. Yet he doesn't do it, or at least it doesn't seemingly do it strictly as a proof of any theological concept, but rather does it in a way to lay all these things out so that we can use them in our lives. We can use them in the way we view the world here now, while we're interacting with each other, while we're trying to build a system of interaction, trying to actually interpret the thoughts we have, the objects around us. I don't know. I might have been interpreting them out of left field, like we kind of discussed. You can have Marx take a liking to him, just as you can have Locke take a liking to him and pull completely separate things out of his works. But I always find myself looking, I guess, a little more consequentialist. I look towards what the impact of the ideas are, or where they can actually be felt in real life, rather than just in purely conceptual realms. And I found that some of the stuff that he had, there's definitely uses for in a very practical sense. Most particularly some of his work when he talks about dangerous reason, or the idea of people having a passive mind or being in a passive state. When he talks about that in his book Ethics, I find that this kind of viewpoint of people being almost detached from their own actions, where they're acting, but they're not acting as actual agents. And that being a very poor form of morality, or a poor form of ethics, and lacking in ethics, because there's no real systematic essence to it. I find that observation almost prophetic, if you will, just because, take a look at that meme that was going around, or is still going around, the NPC meme.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of it. And he was writing about the 17th century. Same way that his view of the universe, he was writing about the conceptualization of how the universe is cross-connected about 2.5 centuries before the advent of quantum mechanics. I mean,
oh yeah. Yeah, he was really ahead of his time. Einstein was a very big fan of his, and a lot of people now will give him credit for being really the grandfather of quantum physics.
which you have to think, and I mean, that really sets the tone right there. Here you have a guy who called the grandfather of quantum mechanics, and he did it solely through thought. He was not a physicist. He was not a scientist. He was a person who sat down and had ideas and thought things through. Yeah. And that's pretty much it. I mean, and this is it was considered.
And he did it mostly just by himself in a room, reading his, collection of works, which wasn't very much in 1600s.
Yeah, I think at most he had access to. It was.
Well, I know he read Aquinas. I know he read Aquinas and Seneca because he mentions both of them a lot in his book. Obviously, he read Descartes. You got to imagine that he had, all the methods of philosophy that were around before him. But still, that wasn't, he didn't have much, scientific information for him to be making, all these crazy observations and assumptions and logically following them through to, the beginning or nature of things, and basically become like I said, the grandfather of quantum mechanics, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think one last thing I think we'll dive into here, just because we had I believe you did listen to it as well, the free will determinism podcast episode I had a couple weeks back with Vinny. Now, Spinoza talked quite a bit about this, and he was very much on the side of determinism. So what would you say is Spinoza's take on determinism?
All right, well, before I get into his take on determinism, because how you were talking about how he influenced so many political minds, and he had, such a big political theory. When he had his political theory, he said, let me step away from myself, step away from that determinist mindset, because, we are among the living. We must assume free will to pretty much survive. But the way he really gets into determinism is it comes from his thoughts on ideas and how they originally come from God, and he explains free will as an illusion, as a rock rolling down a hill, and if the rock could think and have will, it would want to roll down that hill at the exact speed that it was rolling down, and thinking that it had the ultimate freedom to do so. And that is what he called the human delusion of free will.
Mm-hmm. The idea that even though we're assuming we're choosing to take the actions that we're choosing, it's not something that's actually happening. It would have happened whether we're thinking about it or not.
We're basically role players in the totality of things.
Which I find really interesting, considering that he was a rationalist. When you think about it that way.
He was an enigma.
Yeah. Very interesting thinker overall. So we're going to wrap things up a little bit here. What would you say, though, just I guess as the final point, what would you say is the key takeaway from Spinoza's works that people could use to change the way that they look at life, or the way that they look at the world or politics or any of the other things that are involved in all of the areas that Spinoza touched on? What would you say is the key takeaway from his works?
I think what he really set to do as a philosopher is to get people to just sit back and enjoy life, enjoy the nature of things, seek that understanding of the nature of things, so to speak, where we come from, how things originate, and the true forms of things. I think that was the most central point of his philosophy. He wanted to free mankind from the enslavement of mind, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now, for anyone, again, who hasn't gone through any of his works, I definitely recommend giving a read-through on Spinoza. If for nothing else, even if you find yourself disagreeing with the things that he said or the things that he stood for, or you find yourself forming counter-arguments to some of the positions that he held, which it's good to form counter-arguments and to start thinking these processes through. Almost, if nothing else, from a historic perspective, seeing the origin of some of these thoughts and seeing how many different people throughout the ages have been influenced by his work, either consciously or through the work of someone else who was consciously influenced by him, It's a fascinating piece of philosophical history, if you will. So to wrap everything up here, I want to thank everybody for listening to the episode here. Again, this is the first part in a series of these that we're going to be doing on different philosophers. I definitely want to thank Michael for joining us tonight. We had some technical issues that hopefully in post-production you're not going to really notice, but he's been quite patient with us going through fixing all the little technical errors in the background to make sure that everything comes through clearly for you. If you haven't liked Sarcasm Liberty, do make sure to give that a like and keep an eye out for the channels, The Stage and Thunderdome that were mentioned earlier, as well as the live streams that are done on YouTube there. From our end, you can go to our websites and check out the articles that come out on a daily basis for all the new stuff involving politics, philosophy, economics, and all the other things you're hopefully interested in. You can, again, follow me on social media directly by searching up Killian Hobbs Author on Facebook. And as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.